Welcome everyone to another episode of Beyond Binary, and where we explore how technology, ethics, and humanity intersect beyond simple yes or no answers. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Josh Gellers, a global thought leader at the intersection of AI, law, environmental rights, and governance. Dr. Josh is the faculty fellow for artificial intelligence and director of the Digital Humanities Institute at the University of North Florida, a Fulbright scholar and an expert with the Global AI Ethics Institute. Dr. Josh is also the author of The Rights for Robots and the Global Emergence of Constitutional Environmental Rights, where he explores one of the most profound questions of our time: who or what deserves rights in the age of artificial intelligence and planetary crisis? Josh, welcome to Beyond Binary podcast, and we are so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Rupa, and it's great to finally be here.
Thank you, Dr. Josh. Now, Josh, one thing we are seeing right now is that some companies quietly move their AI systems into countries with weaker regulations so that they can do things they could not get away with elsewhere. So, how do we stop AI governance from turning into a global race to the bottom?
Right. So this is a problem that we faced in the environmental realm, right? When companies might locate some of their facilities abroad, potentially with the desire of avoiding some of the more thorny regulations that are present in other parts of the world. And so one of the benefits of a polycentric system where you have different nodes of governance at different levels is it creates a kind of spider web effect. So even if a company were to move to a place that has putatively weaker laws or fewer regulations, there will still be different layers that they would be very difficult to pass through, specifically in the area of global supply chain standards or international trade requirements. And those things would kind of create this way of capturing and elevating what that company would need to do in order to be able to sell those products abroad or to use that product in other countries. So it's about kind of creating different layers that are mapped onto each other, so that you turn this fragmented map into more of a safety net that everyone adheres to.
Amazing. And and also what makes this even more complicated is that AI isn't governed by just one group. You have governments, tech companies, civil society, international organizations all shaping the rules in different ways. So how can
Mhm.
all these players actually work together without everything becoming fragmented or dysfunctional?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really big challenge. And borrowing from my background in international relations, where we talk about regimes, right? So regimes are these sort of groupings of actors, institutions, norms, rules, all that converge around a given issue area. And this is what I told my students at the end of the last semester when I was teaching a graduate course in international relations theory, is kind of how I see myself and how I view the world, is that those rules, those actors, those institutions, they apply based on the issue, not necessarily, one country or regionally and so on. And the examples of this in international relations are everything from nuclear politics to whaling, right? Every country is still part of this larger universe of states, but the extent to which they might participate in any one of these groupings varies based on their level of interest or the way in which it impacts them. So I think one thing I would suggest is thinking about this in terms of a regime or regime complex. So this sort of coupled system in which not every actor is going to be a major player or certainly even agree on everything. And then the next step from there is to engage what I like to think of as modular governance. So in design, right, modularity allows you to switch out certain parts. The sort of classic example of this is carpet that's made of tiles, right? So when there's a spill that happens on the rug, you don't have to upend and rip up the entire rug or the carpet. You can just replace that one tile. And that makes things easier. So what does this look like in the context of governance? It means that you have intergovernmental organizations that might deal with the high level standards, things that you've talked about in your work. Then you have technical standards that are being utilized by organizations like ISO, IEEE. And then, of course, you allow a degree of sovereignty and kind of autochthonous regulatory standards at the national or even local level. And we're currently seeing this tussle happen in the United States, where the federal government has one particular approach to AI, and that is not necessarily the approach that a lot of states are taking. Florida, where I live, is among them. So if every different kind of actor within the system or grouping of actors understands its role as a part of a modular system, and that becomes part of the regime of AI governance, then I think that allows for more of the diversity at the lower level, but thinking at the higher level, organized by some of the sort of ordering principles that you and others have talked about.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Josh. And from the perspective of an organization, that patchwork of laws, standards, and guidelines can feel almost impossible to keep up with. How do companies navigate this maze of AI regulation without becoming paralyzed by complexity?
So yeah, paralysis by analysis is a real thing. And your company wants to be able to operate in one or more jurisdictions, but that presents problems when there are, in the case of the US, there might be 50 different sets of AI laws. So one approach, and it really requires an internal conversation because not every company will be able to follow along these lines. But one approach, in contrast to what you talked about previously, which is the sort of lowest common denominator, is the flip of that, which is the highest common denominator. So if you operate where your ceiling is very, rather your floor is very high, then that will allow you to satisfy the requirements in multiple places. It only becomes a problem if you are trying to operate in one place, but you have maybe very few regulations or internal governance and things like that. So if you elevate your company's standards to sort of the gold standard that exists, it allows you the opportunity, at least, to go in other jurisdictions. So it doesn't mean reading every local law because most companies don't have the resources to do that. It's about looking at this through the lens of a highest common denominator, and then that allows you to build safely in the largest number of places.
Amazing. And even when companies understand the rules, there are often a big gap between what they say and what they actually do. And almost everyone has an ethics statement now, but far fewer live by it. So from what you have seen, what usually prevents good intentions from becoming real practice?
So I don't fault companies, especially those that are not involved in technology, for experiencing difficulty trying to translate those principles into practical, actionable aspects of their business operations, their performance, KPIs, all those sorts of things, because there's this kind of tension between how engineers are trained, especially those in the AI space, and then taking these very otherwise philosophical kinds of principles. And the engineers, by and large, are not trained in those principles and are guided by them when creating products or like AI systems. So think about like something like fairness, right? How do you engineer fairness? Or if you're a company that's not really involved in the production of AI systems, but you are using them, how do you ensure that your company abides by this otherwise very abstract idea? So, to translate principles into practice, what we need to do is make things actionable in a way that can be readily understood on a technical level. So, basically, for example, this would be taking something like I'm using the example of fairness and having internally that conversation about how you define that. What does fairness look like if you are a toy company? What does fairness look like if you are working in software as a service in the housing sector? What does that look like if you're in financial services? So it may be sector specific. It may be specific to the values of your own company. Um, and so you have to not think so much about, like how do we take what is written in an academic document or in a UNESCO policy piece, but thinking about how we can kind of render that meaningful to our own employees and our customers and our users. So basically, we have this translation problem. Engineers, again, are not taught to think in these terms by and large. So without concrete technical definitions, um, AI ethics will remain a kind of PR exercise. And this means that each company may have to kind of do their own fact finding and their own soul searching to operationalize that in ways that make sense for them.
Great. And Dr. Josh, a lot of AI ethics conversations focus on things like privacy, bias, explainability, fairness, which matter. But in many parts of the global south, the realities are far more about labor exploitation, data extraction, and surveillance. So, how do we build a global AI ethics agenda that actually reflects those unequal power dynamics?
So this is, I mean, what you are an expert in, so I might be preaching to the choir here, but I'm really glad that you brought this up because as you've noticed, as I've mentioned recently on LinkedIn, that the discourse, especially in the West, tends to be on this debate between sort of like boosterism and doomerism. Um, but the people in the global South, the global majority, are the people who are living the impacts of the race to supremacy in AI. And so one suggestion that I would have starts with a rhetorical shift, which is moving from this notion of AI safety, which many people in the West, especially like the UK and the US, are familiar with, and moving towards one that is about AI justice and what that looks like for the people who are frontline workers in this race to be the most dominant AI powerhouse. And I'm really influenced by the work of folks like Sasha Costanza-Chock, who wrote Design Justice. A lot of those same principles can be applied in the context of AI. And so this involves things like supply chain transparency. Just like we have labeling standards with environmental goods, food items, we have to think about that kind of thing being done right now. Hugging Face and Salesforce are kind of leading the way with that through their energy score, but it's really difficult because what you're having to do is ask companies to voluntarily supply information that could be used against them in the court of public opinion. And so no company really wants to be the first actor, no big tech company anyway. And so we have this problem where there's no incentive for them to disclose. So we have to think about better mechanisms for encouraging or incentivizing transparency that we can use to inform consumers. Another thing, which I think you alluded to, is this notion of data sovereignty. So instead of just simply extracting information from people in the developing country and using it to sell products back to them, but thinking about how that data can be maintained within national borders and not sold to technology companies in China or Russia or the United States. Thinking about context-specific applications of AI principles. So harm or no harm is like a big principle in the environmental space. It's also been applied in AI. Harm in the global north or in the west might be thought of in terms of, someone who is discriminated against in terms of housing applications, like we've had issues here in the US, or being discriminated in terms of criminal justice issues. Whereas for the global majority, it might be about, using AI as a surveillance tool to suppress labor organizing so that people who are even working in the AI space won't be able to engage in collective bargaining and things like that. So context-based application of AI ethics principles that are relevant to those areas and those individuals experiencing that is also important. So right now we need to make this shift from Silicon Valley and how they conceive of things to more of a global South reality, the global majority. What are the sort of concerns, whether it's about how AI is being used or how we are obtaining the raw materials and labor that is being used as inputs to create these AI systems.
Amazing. And finally, if we zoom out from all that, it seems like many organizations still make ethical decisions using cost benefit mindset. What's legal, what's profitable, and what's acceptable risk. So, what would AI governance look like if we were really based on doing what's right and not just what's useful? And do you think that's actually possible inside modern institutions?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked this question because years ago, one of my, I think it was my first qualifying paper in graduate school was on this notion of how can we move away from neoclassical economics, specifically cost benefit analysis, but again, in the context of the environment. Some of those same ideas resonate with what we're talking about today in terms of AI. So think about those sort of logical implications of using cost benefit analysis in this area of AI, right? So, for instance, you might look at how or the likelihood or the probability or the rate at which people are actively harmed by some kind of use of AI. And I'll just use the example of, criminal justice, right? So maybe 1% of the time, the AI that's being used in sentencing guidelines produces a really horrible result for people who should not have been incarcerated at all, or certainly not for as long as the AI recommends. So a cost benefit analysis and would look at that and say, or if we were using a CBA, well, 1%, compared to 99% means that, for that every 99 people, only one person is being harmed. But that one person could be, put away incarcerated for the rest of their life. So the magnitude of the harm could be very high, even though the distribution of that or the frequency was very low. But if we use something like different kinds of impact assessments, and by the couple of examples I have are human rights impact assessments and algorithmic impact assessments. So eschewing this idea that we can just sort of do a calculation on a budget spreadsheet, right, between like inputs and outputs, and moving more towards thinking about how do we look at on a more systematic basis, kind of breaking apart what these models do, what is their impact in the real world, taking this as talk about it in ethical terms, a deontological position where we have sort of bright lines between what we're willing to accept and what we're not willing to accept, instead of this gradation where we think about percentages. So this kind of a shift from a CBA to more of an impact analysis is something that requires a bit more of a moral conversation within organizations, because I think most people, especially those who are in MBAs, are used to thinking about things in these more strictly quantitative terms. But what we have to realize is some things cannot be simply traded off, right? We think of everything as fungible, everything as quantifiable, but it's really difficult in human terms, in ethical terms, to make those kinds of distinguishing kind of calculations. So, whereas a utilitarian logic allows you to engage in a little bit of injustice when you think the overall impact is quite small, a deontological approach supplants that with these bright lines, but it includes a kind of governance mechanism, which is this impact assessment. And so I think whether it's conducted through like third party auditing or people internally who are constantly or regularly using these impact assessments, that move away from a cost benefit analysis will help us get closer to that AI justice vision.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Josh. This has been such a powerful conversation, and not just about technology, but about the kind of world we are building through it. And what you have reminded us that AI governance isn't really about algorithms or regulations. It is about who gets protected, who gets heard, and who gets left out. So thank you for bringing such clarity, courage, and wisdom to this conversation. And and to everyone listening, if this episode made you pause, reflect, or rethink what responsible AI really means, and then we have done our job here on Beyond Binary. Until next time, stay curious, stay courageous, and keep thinking beyond binary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.